Ahoy, my friends, and welcome to another Intrepid adventure. Thank you so much for joining us today for Anchors Aweigh, where we are going to explore the culture of a life at sea. So, we're going to talk about the origins of the Navy, some of their very unique ways of life. But first off, everyone, allow me to introduce myself. My name's Alicia, and I'm an educator at the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum here in New York City. I'll be your host today for the program. And just as a reminder, the museum's live streams are free, but if you'd like to support us in delivering programs just like these, please do click in the link in the comments or in the description. So feel free to use the chat today to say hello. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Let us know maybe if you've ever been to the Intrepid Museum before. And of course, if you've got any questions, you can put them there as well. Now, at the Intrepid Museum, our mission is to honor our heroes, educate the public, and inspire our youth. And so, a quick recap for those of you who may not be familiar with our museum. Here it is, the Intrepid Museum. So we're located in a historic World War II aircraft carrier, the USS Intrepid. It was constructed in 1943, and it served in 3 wars: World War II, the Cold War, and the Vietnam War. And then in 1982, it was converted into what it is now, the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum. So we are docked right off the shoreline of Manhattan in the Hudson River, just a short walk west from Times Square. And we are, of course, now open to the public 7 days a week. So if you're in the area, please do come on by and visit us and say hello. Now, of course, here at the museum, we do talk about a number of topics relating to sea, air, and space. What else? And today we are going to focus specifically, though, on the culture that could be found on ships, specifically the customs and traditions found on board the U.S. Navy ships. Everything from uniforms to slang to even food. So to start us off, the origins of the Navy actually predate the Revolutionary War by almost a year. On August 26, 1775, the then colony of Rhode Island requested that a fleet of force be created for the protection of the American ports and the waters from, of course, the British. Well, 2 months later, on October 13th, a naval force was created. They modeled it on the British Navy, and it protected our American colonies all the way south to Georgia, which was, one of the colonies back then, but the furthest south that they would go. Now, when the American Revolution ended, the Navy was actually disbanded. The British were no longer blockading our ports, so the colonists really saw no need for it anymore. But of course, dangers were still definitely out there. For instance, a decade later, we got involved in something called the Barbary Wars, when the North African pirates captured American ships and they tried to ransom their passengers and crew. During the French Revolution, also despite being neutral, many American ships were plundered. So the states realized, they actually still really do need that naval power for defense. So in 1794, Congress brought back the Navy, headed up by President John Adams, and they more formally established the Department of the Navy with 50 ships. And fun fact, some of those were even named Intrepid, like our ship, and Enterprise, like our space shuttle. How cool is that? Now, the Navy was later instrumental during the Civil War and, of course, also during World War II, when the Intrepid, of course, our aircraft carrier, Intrepid, were first active in the Pacific. And today, U.S. Navy is still actually quite active around the world, both for national defense and also in response to regional events as well. Now, today, you might commonly recognize members of the Navy by their very notable sailor uniforms, like the modern ones you could see here on the right. If you've ever been around New York City in May, for example, you might also see them out in full force during Fleet Week, where sailors are given a well-earned week-long shore leave to relax, have fun, refuel, run around New York City a little bit before returning out to sea, in normal times anyway. So we certainly do love hosting them here at the museum as well during our week-long Fleet Week celebration too. So hopefully this year coming up, we'll be able to do it again, and you should definitely come on by and check that out too. But there has been a very long sense of reverence and awe over someone in a uniform. And of course, they can take on a variety of different styles. Maybe you wear a uniform at school, or maybe you play on a sports team and you've got a uniform that you wear during your games too. So, uniforms help to identify us, to unite people. And of course, each branch of the military has their own unique uniforms based on the type of work that they do. Now, of course, many people instantly would think of the Navy uniform looking, again, like this picture here, maybe even the blue variant of it. And Guy Lombardo even sang a song about it, bell bottom trousers, coat of navy blue. So it's this unchanging kind of stereotypical sailor uniform that people have come to recognize over 2 centuries now. But the uniform actually has undergone many changes over the years. Each one has adapted itself to changing needs or trends of the time. You can see really kind of a chronology here of all the different styles that it's looked like over the years. But unlike an officer's uniform, which began really as a reflection of its social status and then evolved into more of their environment, the enlisted soldier or sailor's clothes were really more about practicality. So all of the pieces were used either for protection against the elements or to create distinctions among their jobs. In another program, for example, we talk about the different colors that they wear on the flight deck, right? But most importantly, they really wanted simplicity so that it wouldn't interfere with their everyday tasks. So, first off, the use of something called the fouled anchor, as you can see here, as a Navy insignia really came about from where else? British naval tradition. And it dates all the way back to 1588, really, really long time ago. But what does that mean exactly? The fouled anchor, not just a regular anchor, right? So if you look closely at this picture here, you can see that the anchor is actually entangled or wrapped up in its own chain. Now, when something is fouled, generally that means something went wrong or it's facing some kind of a difficulty. And the term really dates back to usage when wind-driven sailing ships, those big tall masts with the sails, right? They really used it to symbolize the trials and tribulations that the sailors would go through on a day-to-day basis. It was hard work being out there at sea. So this, fouled anchor was to represent those hard times. Also, though, the use of the letters USN, at first glance, you would, of course, think, oh, that represents US Navy. But it actually also represents other words: unity, so teamwork and cooperation; service, which reminds us, of course, of service to others as well as the Navy; and navigation, reminding sailors to stay on a true course with everyone that they encounter, as well as on their ships, too. So the anchor can still be found very widely on things like buttons and official seals, right? Which we will talk about in just a bit, as well as on their cap badges, too. So you can always keep an eye out for that, and more than likely you'll be able to see that on some of our uniforms here. Now, when the Navy was first just getting underway 200 years ago, again, there was no official uniform for ships' crews. They just wore whatever clothing they happened to have when they enlisted, or clothes that maybe those in charge decided would be best appropriate, and then they kept them aboard the ship in their slop chest. Now, more often than not, the early uniforms, as you can see here, really just consisted of pants that were often tied up at the knee, also referred to as knee breeches, a shirt, a short-waisted jacket, and a low-crowned hat. Now, the length of those short trousers were actually, again, really for practical purposes so that they wouldn't interfere with the work that they were doing, because they were rigging up ships, all these ropes everywhere, right? They wouldn't get all tangled up in it. So most sailors also went barefoot, as you can see with this guy on the left here. And they also often wore a kerchief or a bandana, either as a sweatband or just as a simple closure for their collar of their shirt, too. But about that necktie, right? Sailors of old often wore their hair braided in a pigtail, and they kept it really stiff with grease or tar. Again, they didn't want it getting in the way. This would never be great if I'm rigging up ships, right? So they kept it, kept back, and again, with lots of grease or tar to keep it all together. So to protect their clothing from all of that grease, they would wear a piece of cloth tied around their neck. And eventually, the cloth was just sewn onto their shirt as a collar. And now, even today, they still do have that neckerchief, but it's really just for show. And again, just to kind of harken back to the old days. Now, also thinking about the uniforms, you might think that, oh, flared bell bottoms, hey, those became a thing in like the 60s or 70s, right? With the disco era. But believe it or not, they actually came into being way back before that in the 1800s in the Navy. And one of the earliest recorded descriptions of Navy clothing actually comes from the personal papers of Commodore Stephen Decatur in the early 1800s. And he said his sailors wore blue jackets buttoned loosely over waistcoats and blue trousers with bell bottoms. The bell bottoms were actually used, though, for a number of practical reasons. The first was that they were easily removed if someone went overboard, so they wouldn't weight you down in the water because, trying to take your clothes off underwater is very difficult as it is. The second reason is that they covered, of course, their boots, their shoes, so it wouldn't get things like rain or the ocean spray inside of your shoes, keep your feet dry. The third is that they were really easy to roll up above the knee while they were scrubbing their deck. So again, a lot of, function there. But also they could hold a lot of air. All right. So if you imagine that the legs are tied off at the ends and you were able to get some air into that, they could be used as an emergency flotation device if you were floating out in the water. So a lot of really, important and clever aspects to these pants that they would wear, even, having to do with their jobs while at sea. So the Navy's first official uniform regulations came about in 1841. And as years progressed, of course, other updates and additions were added. And of course, the Navy also was expanding and roles were growing much more varied as time went on. And one example of this can actually be seen in the use of khaki. All right, so this khaki color, this kind of brownish color, khaki actually originated in 1845 in India when British soldiers would soak their white uniforms in mud and coffee and curry powder to try to blend in more with the desert landscape. So khaki pants really made their debut with the U.S. Navy in 1912. They were frequently worn by naval aviators at the time, but they were later also adopted for use in submarines and then also eventually on and off-site work as well. And now you see khaki all throughout the military as well. So everyone, before heading on, I want to just pause here and see if we've got any questions before we, go on to our next section, talking a little bit more about culture and stuff. Why do sailors sometimes wear blue or white uniforms? Sure, great catch, actually, too. So sometimes you see that very, common uniform that I pointed out before, but sometimes it might be blue with white trim or white with blue trim. Yeah. So when those regulations first came about in 1841, that was actually the first time that you specifically saw designations for a blue Navy uniform or a white one. And honestly, it just had to do with the weather. Basically, they wore the blue wool when it was cold, and they wore the white one when it was warm. Because, of course, you wear the white in the summertime, it reflects the heat a little bit more. The blue also can trap it in. Also, might have had to do with the materials it was made out of. But that was all distinguished in that regulation code there, specifically saying it had to do with the weather. So oftentimes, of course, during Fleet Week, you see all those sailors running around in their white outfit. And I believe it's still the same today. Good catch. All right. Any other questions? What did female Navy uniforms look like? Awesome. So yeah, when women first began participating in the Navy, and really now this was, first during about World War I, when they were able to first start fighting in the Navy, or serving in the Navy, I should say, they were called Yeoman F. So yeoman with a parentheses F, designating that they were female, or also commonly referred to as yeomanettes. But they were mainly doing things like clerical work or jobs like radio operators or photographers or even some design work. They helped to design things like camouflage and stuff. So they actually did have their own uniform, but they were definitely inspired by the era. So, of course, no pants yet for the ladies during World War II. They commonly wore a single-breasted blue coat in the winter, and then also white in the summer. So again, actually the same designations with the blue and the white. They wore a long skirt and also a straight brimmed sailor hat, and then, black shoes and stockings too. So, definitely a separate uniform for them at the time. But as time passed on, and as, of course, things like pants, for women became more the norm and everything has definitely evolved since then. And now female sailors and officers in the Navy definitely dress the same, as the uniforms of their male counterparts as well. All right. So in addition to the uniforms, everyone, you might say that, ships also kind of wore a uniform in the flag that they flew. we say the same thing about our airplanes as well. They've got their roundels, they've got their flags, right, that designate what country they're for. So ships kind of in the same way have that too. So the earliest period of the nation's naval history wore a variety of flags, just as the country itself did. And you can see some here. So early flags like these, on the left, you've got a pine tree that says Liberty Tree Appeal to God. Also, you've got the infamous "Don't Tread on Me" rattlesnake. So these might be familiar if you're, used to looking at some of this early colonial history. But those banners actually really helped to shape and inform the American flag, the stars and stripes that we have today, rather than a specific flag for the Navy itself. So the Navy SEAL back then, that you can see on the right here, was originally created to be actually flown on a flag, and it was adopted by Continental Congress in 1780. It on it had 13 bars across the center of it there, and it's said to be mutually supporting each other. So, of course, the 13 signifying the 13 colonies. Above it, or rather below it, you can see an anchor. Of course, the anchor symbol. The crest is the sailing ship on top there, and then it's surrounded by the motto "Sustentans et sustentatum." Not very good at Latin, but that's Latin for sustaining and having sustained. So again, really this, idea of staying strong. But remember, the Continental Navy of the American Revolution went away shortly after the American Revolution. So that seal actually did not last very long at all. Well, a few years later, when the Department of the Navy was founded, they created a new seal, which actually contains many of the basic elements of the official seal that's still in use today, that you can see here. So you've got the sea, the sailing ship, the eagle, the anchor. Again, a lot of these things that represent the Navy, America, right? But there are some slight variants. The seal most commonly used today was approved in 1957. And it's got, as you can see here, this nice fair sky. You've got a fairly calm sea. And also noticeably, you've got some land in the base. Also, of course, the anchor is on the land. And then on top of it, you've got an American bald eagle with 1 foot on the ground and 1 foot on the anchor. Now, there's a lot of symbolism there. The land in the design symbolizes the Navy's supporting shore facilities, as well as its amphibious strike capabilities. So that means it could go on land and on sea. So it's actually embracing the Navy's kind of total worldwide operations, both at sea, ashore, and also in the air, too. So other types of flags that were important, though, on ships, aside from the seal, aside from the Navy flag that we talked about, were these things called signal flags, which if you've tuned into some of our other programming, maybe you've learned about those. So the modern ones you can see here on screen, flag signaling was actually believed to have been established by the Greeks during the Peloponnesian Wars, even back 400 BCE, long time ago. Different flags were used, obviously, but it actually wasn't until the early 1800s that a real system like the one we use today was established for communication at sea. So most navies today use this, the International Code of Signals, or the ICS, for maritime use. It's got these 26 letters, A to Z, supplemented also sometimes by some additional special code flags if they happen to have them. And the flags themselves can be flown either on their own, which signals, again, an international message, or in groupings, which might indicate some kind of coded messages or also maneuvers within a fleet. So, for instance, looking at these flags here, a single use of the flag O, so Oscar, it's the yellow and red one on there, that would actually indicate that you have a man overboard if you flew just that flag up. U, uniform, which is the red and white checkerboard one there. That one warns of danger up ahead. Also, W, whiskey, kind of the red and white and blue bullseye kind of situation, but the squared off one there, requests medical assistance. So again, this is if you fly them just by themselves. Whereas if you've got, a combination of things like B and Z, so Bravo and Zulu, that actually would often be used to indicate the phrase of approval, well done. So good job. Another example, C, Charlie, signals yes, usually. N, November, signals no. But when you use both of them together, it's a distress signal. So clearly, if you're not sure if it's yes or no, what's going on up there? It's a sign of distress. Now, in everyday life, outside of flags, right, you've also probably maybe heard or even said some sayings that have some historic naval origin. So maybe some, that you can see here even. For instance, the phrase, "I have not yet begun to fight," was supposedly coined by Captain John Paul Jones during a very famous battle in 1779. Apparently, some of Jones's men cried for surrender at the time, but he refused. And when asked by the captain of the other ship if he had in fact surrendered, he said the immortal words, "I have not yet begun to fight." Now, another infamous quote, of course, "Don't give up the ship," was commanded by Captain James Lawrence after being mortally wounded during the War of 1812. As he was carried below the decks to safety, he loudly ordered, "Tell the men to fire faster. Don't give up the ship." Although his ship, the Chesapeake, was eventually forced to surrender, his words ended up living on as a rallying cry during the war. It was very inspiring. And in fact, Oliver Hazard Perry honored his deceased friend when he had the motto even sewn onto his own private battle flag flown during the Battle of Lake Erie. And you can actually see a reproduction of that flag on the right here with all those guys standing around it. Now, it was just after that battle that he actually uttered another very famous phrase, "We have met the enemy and they are ours," which is an immortal dispatch to Major General William Henry Harrison. His victory that day helped to secure the Great Lakes region for the United States during the War of 1812, and it ended actually the threat of invasion from that area during the time. And then, of course, maybe you've also heard the phrase, "Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition." Well, that one comes from Reverend Lieutenant Howell M. Forgy while serving in the USS New Orleans during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. He actually saw the men of an ammunition party tiring as they were carrying these heavy shells to the anti-aircraft guns. So he decided to add his moral support with words of encouragement. He wasn't actually allowed to fight or help them. So he just patted the men on the back and said, "Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition." So his words were actually later popularized in a song written by Frank Lesser and performed by Kay Kaiser and his orchestra in the 40s. So some fun little phrases here that maybe you've heard before, wondered where they came from. Now, there's actually also a number of naval slang terms that were popularized by those at sea throughout history. So you've probably, of course, heard the phrase "anchors aweigh," right? For instance, or maybe the song, right, which we'll mention in a bit. But that phrase, "anchors aweigh," actually refers to when the anchor is clear of the sea bottom. So it is no longer fastened to land. And to weigh anchor, that term, the phrase "to weigh anchor," it means bring it aboard a ship in preparation for departure. So it means you're setting sail effectively. Now, the word "aweigh," Aweigh, is also believed to be derived from Old English. There's a word, way, I believe that's how you pronounce it, Woeg, and that means to raise or to move or to carry. So that makes a lot of sense. So as "anchors aweigh" means we're going off and setting sail. Now, scuttlebutt, which is kind of a funny term. In the cartoon on the left here, this is from World War I. So this sailor here is looking at a bulletin board with tons of conflicting information on it saying, "I wonder what kind of scuttlebutt dope that is." Now, scuttlebutt refers to rumors or gossip. The scuttlebutt was the drinking fountain on the ship. Scuttle means drill, and butt means cask. So that kind of makes sense there. And then when the crew would gather around for a drink, they would exchange rumors of the voyage or what they'd been hearing. And so it's basically the office water cooler. So that's also kind of another funny term. But the military around the world, of course, had a number of phrases that overlapped within branches as well. So here's another cartoon on the right from the Royal Air Force during World War II. It says, "Hey, wait a minute, half a minute. Shooting a line, putting up a black, going for a Burton, taking a dim view. What kind of language is that?" So I'll break it down for you. Shooting a line means to exaggerate your accomplishments. Putting up a black means something to make a big stink about. And then going for a Burton meant being killed in action, which actually came from an old beer commercial for Burton Ale. And then taking a dim view is to view something with kind of skepticism or disapproval. So a lot of these fun, terms and phrases that kind of came about from being out at sea and from, picking up language just while you're out there from all the different ports and things too. Now, some other things that you might be familiar with. Maybe you've worn a pea coat, right? Like we, one of these common things that the Navy uniforms actually used. So sailors have been wearing them for more than 200 years. It's their top coat that was worn in cold weather. And it's actually believed that the pea coat got its name from the Dutch word piege. I think I'm saying that right, which is a coarse woolen cloth. Or also perhaps from the fact that it was made out of a coat, or that the coat was made out of something called pilot cloth, which was a heavy, really, again, coarse, stout, kind of twilled blue cloth. So these types of coats were called pea coats, just pea dash coat, and the pea, of course, being short for pilot cloth. You can, so commonly even buy those coats today. And oftentimes you might notice, even when you buy them from a store, on the buttons, you might see the little anchor symbol. I actually have one myself that's got little anchors on it. There's no reason other than the fact that they actually originated in the Navy. Now, also, to toe the line. Maybe you've heard that before. That's another common phrase. Again, this is tow, not as in tow, T-O-W, to haul or to carry something, but actually the toes on your feet. So back in the days of wooden ships, there was sealant between the deck's planks, wooden planks, of course, and they formed lines, as you can actually see in this picture here. So the sailors would literally place their toes up to the line while reporting for duty, filing a line here, as you can see. But this was also used as a form of punishment for unruly sailors who had to toe the line in silence for long periods of time, too. But that is where that comes from. Again, towing the line, putting your toes on the lines. Also today, you might have heard the phrase hit the head. Oh, well, the head was a term used for the bathroom on a ship. On old sailing ships, way back in the 1700s, when sailors would need to relieve themselves, they would commonly go to an area below the deck in the front of the ship near the figurehead, which is often, where you see like a person or a mermaid or something in the front, which actually is probably where they get the term head of the ship too. It's, maybe your head facing into the wind and the head of the figurehead. But this area was specifically chosen for the bathroom for a couple of reasons. So the wind almost always came from behind them. So the sailors would actually go in the front so as to not, get caught in the wind blowing back at them, if you know what I mean. Also, any smells would dissolve into the air before reaching the main living and working areas too. And then also just the constant spray of ocean water kind of acted as a natural sanitizer too, and it kept the area relatively clean. So as you can see in this picture, there's the head. And there's someone using it. So everyone, I want to pause here again and see if we've got any more questions. You all have learned so much exciting stuff now, right? All right. Oh, yes, there we go. So what is a poop deck? I have to admit, I had a feeling someone would ask that question, so I actually even made a slide for you. So here you go. Poop deck. All right. So talking about the head, of course, kind of gives new meaning to the term now, poop deck, which actually has nothing to do with going to the bathroom. It is on the opposite side of the ship. It is on the back of the ship. The poop deck forms the roof of a cabin that's built in, again, the rear of the ship. And it gets its name from the French word for stern, the back side of the ship, la poupe. I guess I'm pronouncing that right. Poop. It just sounds so much fancier when you say it with a French accent, though, right? And it's usually actually where you see, the helmsman steering the vessel on those old ships, too. So in this picture, for example, you can see the big wheel there. But it's the back deck of the ship. And it comes from a French word for stern. It's not poop like number 2. Awesome, though. Any other questions? Oh, where'd the Jolly Roger come from? All right. So yeah, if you're not familiar with that term, it's that pirate flag, right? That black flag with the skull and crossbones, right? You've probably seen that before. We actually have a symbol of that on one of our planes too that we highlight. It's a very common symbol nowadays, and it actually does come from the 1700s. There are a few records back then of pirate flags actually just being, even just solid black to start. That's ominous, right? There is a reference to one that's all black, for example, with a full skeleton too, that's like stabbing a heart with a spear. That was referred to as Jolly Roger. Also, there's the term Jolly Rouge. pretty red in French. That's a reference to French privateers. So they'd go around, the red color being a reference, of course, to the violent nature of those guys, lots of bloodshed, you know. There was also a reference to an old Roger flag that was all black again, with a portrait of the Grim Reaper on it, with an hourglass in one hand and, you know, like a knife or a dart in the other one. So there's a lot of references. No one is 100% certain where the Jolly Roger that we know of today came from, but it's believed to be kind of a blend of a lot of these older ideas that, you know, they sailed under this dark flag, these dark purposes, and they were basically leaving death in their wake. So it was kind of just to scare people, I think. And it works too, right? Pirate flags are spooky. All right, now everyone, another thing that the Navy is known for, of course, besides their flag and their poop decks, right, it's some really good food. Because, of course, if you are going to send thousands of young men out to sea for 6 to 9 months at a time, what better way to bribe them than with some really good food, or at least help them keep their morale up, right? And the Intrepid in particular was known for some really great food. Now, Intrepid's cooks prepared about 7 tons of food every day for her hungry crew, certainly over about 3,000 men at any given time. And on board, they had these 2 very large kitchens called galleys, fully equipped with really the same grills and fryers and ovens that you might find in a big restaurant. And you can really imagine, even looking at these pictures, what a hot and really fast-paced and exhausting job it would have been to feed all of those ravenous young men, right? So at mealtimes, crewmen lined up on the chow line, just like you can see here. This is from 1967 on the left. The sailors would take steel trays through the serving line. They selected their food. It was given to them by the commissary men. They were dishing up food there for about 15 hours a day. They started well before breakfast and were going way on till after dinner. And then they would take their food and they returned to the mess or the dining area nearby to eat. So really, you can imagine that kind of like a big cafeteria space that you might even have at school. Now, the bakers on board also made bread and pastries, all from scratch, all day long. In the bake shop, there were groups of about 3 or 4 sailors who worked for 12-hour shifts. The night shift would bake as many as 800 loaves of bread at a time. And then the day shift would prepare all these desserts. So, you know, typically something sweet, maybe like 60 smaller cakes and pies and cobblers and cookies for every single lunch and dinner. Sweet stuff's important to keep you happy, of course. You also had muffins and cinnamon rolls and, you know, all these other pastries for breakfast too. Now, the photo on the right here of the bakers was taken on board a Navy ship during World War II. And it shows the bakers posing right there with all of their bread in the bake shop. But again, just imagine how hot it would get with all of those ovens going all the time. Oh my gosh. Now, of course, with, you know, 3,000 men, you can imagine they left a lot of dirty dishes too. And the dishes were washed in areas called sculleries. And the newer sailors actually were often assigned to those areas. They were called mess cooks, but the name's a little misleading because they didn't actually cook. They were cleaning the mess and the galley and the scullery areas, and they would prepare the food to be cooked. So, you know, oftentimes if you go working in a restaurant, you'll start off in positions like that too. You'll do some of the cleaning, you'll do some of the prepping of things, lots of prepping of things. But of course, although Intrepid did have industrial dishwashers, eventually, you know, sailors really did scrub many of those items by hand. Now, chow, this idea of mealtime, was a time to relax and to really take a break from work. And as I said, food was very important for morale, to keep their spirits up. So the cooks would often plan very special meals for the holidays, which of course were a very difficult time for many crew members who were away from their loved ones back home. So on Thanksgiving Day and Christmas Day, dinners, you know, would include some of these very traditional holiday favorites to help them pass these long hours at sea and to really help to bond the crew into a tight-knit team. So here's an example. This is Thanksgiving Day of 1945. Intrepid's cooks served, you know, lots of the traditional foods that we associate with the holiday. You can see here, this is, again, their official menu from that day. We had roast turkey, oyster stuffing, mashed sweet potatoes, cream of tomato soup, mixed candies. They even offered them cigars and cigarettes to unwind afterwards. And, you know, this was a really nice way for them to kind of bond and take a break for a while and really celebrate the Thanksgiving Day. Now, there were other celebratory meals on board naval ships too, though. Celebrations with, of course, their accompanying cakes really brought the entire crew together and boosted their spirits. It really helped the crew, again, to take their minds off of more difficult aspects of their service, the boredom, the monotony, but also, of course, the danger and sometimes death, too. So, for instance, in August of 1944, the Intrepid crew members gathered together to celebrate their first anniversary. So, the first anniversary of Intrepid's commissioning. And the year had been really eventful, very difficult. They had entered into the Pacific War. They got their first battle scars, including losing 30 shipmates to combat or accidents. So, again, this was a time where food could bring them together and they could kind of, really reflect on the past year, the good things and also the sad things. So the Intrepid bakers unveiled this very elaborate creation for their first anniversary. This was a 2-tiered sheet cake with a cake aircraft carrier perched on top. You can see here. This finished cake weighed over 728 pounds and it required 90 dozen eggs. Whoa. So you can see here the bakers putting some finishing touches on it there. Really, really a spectacular cake. And then likewise, on August 16th, 1968, the Intrepid was operating in the Gulf of Tonkin during the Vietnam War. The crew took a break to gather on the flight deck in celebration of its 25th commissioning anniversary. It was still going strong. So the ship's bakers here designed an elaborate 5-layer sheet cake with airplanes on top, you can see there, and it weighed 1,400 pounds. The sailors actually had to move it on a bomb lift. It was so big. Really, really large cake here. And we actually have a full-size replica of it at our ship right now with our cakes exhibit too. So be sure to check that out if you come in there. Here you can actually see in the picture, you've got the captain handing the first slices back to the bakers, who of course had worked so hard, spending a whole week just assembling this massive, massive confection. And of course, what took a week to make was polished off by all of those hungry sailors in just a couple of hours. I don't blame them, though. That's a really awesome cake. So they found a lot of things to celebrate to keep their spirits high. They really tried to stay optimistic. They kept a running count of arrested landings. So that is when the airplane's tail hook catches on a steel cable across the flight deck. That's how they basically stop on a very short runway. And so the officers would call on the bakers to create cakes every 1,000 of those. So they had a fair number of cakes there. But really, if you think about it, to bake a cake that big for so many people, you need a lot of ingredients, right? So the Intrepid left port, of course, packed with enough supplies just to sustain, these 3,000 crew members for long stretches at sea. Most of the provisions, of course, were canned or dried or frozen so that they could last as long as possible. But each recipe was actually written to feed 100 people. This is an example of one for easy chocolate cake. The cooks would scale the recipe then to feed the crew of their ship depending on how big the ship in question was. So the aircraft carrier Intrepid had a crew of about 3,000 people, sometimes even more than that, sometimes closer to 4,000, which means the ship's bakers had to do some math, right? They had to multiply this recipe by 30 to feed the entire crew. And that sounds like it might be giant, but, of course, consider the size of the slices, too. They wouldn't all be as giant as, some of the pictures that we were looking at there. But, the typical cake slices were a little smaller. But, also realize that, there's a lot of people there. So they have to do what they have to do to make sure everyone gets fed and everyone gets a slice of that exciting cake. Now, in addition to cakes, sailors also had some other celebratory traditions here. For centuries now, they have engaged in rituals when their ships cross certain marker milestones, such as the equator, right? And again, these were meant to bond the sailors and boost their morale, like everything else. So, for example, on January 22nd, 1944, the first crew that served on the aircraft carrier Intrepid, where, of course, we have our museum, crossed the equator. So the crew marked this occasion with this time-honored naval tradition called the line crossing ceremony. And you can see a few pictures of it here. These are from a whole bunch of different ships, all right? Other line crossing ceremonies, even over the past century, all right? Some more modern and some a lot older here. But the open seas, of course, have been the subject of myths and legends since the beginning of seafaring, and early sailors would frequently pray to the god Neptune, god of the sea, to ask for protection from things like monsters and storms. So at some point, over 400 years ago now, right, the line crossing ceremony began for sailors. It is this tradition that celebrates their transformation from a slimy pollywog, which is someone who has never crossed the line of the equator, to a trusty shellback, or a son or daughter of Neptune, who has now become part of this fraternity of seasoned sailors, right? So it was a way for sailors to be tested for their seaworthiness, and also kind of could be considered a form of hazing as well. But here's how this highly theatrical event would work. All right. So the day before a ship crossed the equator, King Neptune, who was played usually by the most veteran sailor, even the captain, would come on board to proclaim his authority and to pass judgment on all of these polywogs who he claims have not properly honored him. Now, of course, he is dressed in full costume, full regalia as King Neptune, and he also arrives with his full court, typically comprised of his queen, which is often played by a sailor in drag. You've got Davy Jones and the royal baby and all of these other dignitaries, who, of course, also the more seasoned sailors there, all dressed in their costumes. The polywogs then entertain them with a talent show. And then the next morning, they're forced to eat a very unappetizing breakfast. Usually it's very spicy of some sort now. They perform a variety of very embarrassing and very messy activities across the deck before then finally taking a royal bath in a pool of garbage. So it doesn't sound very fun in the moment, but it's a really great bonding experience for them. And after that point, after they've completed all this, they receive an official certificate, just like you can see here on the left here, that declares them to be shellbacks and acknowledges their initiation into the solemn mysteries of the ancient order of the deep. And of course, in addition to the equator, there's other ones. So the certificate on the bottom here is the Order of Magellan. And that's from when the Intrepid circumnavigated the globe, meaning going all the way around the Earth during its last deployment during the Vietnam War. That's when that one was received. And then you've got other certificates that initiate them into things like the Order of the Golden Dragon for crossing the international dateline towards Asia. You've got the Royal Order of the Blue Noses for crossing the Arctic Circle, and the Royal Domain of the Emperor Penguin, of course, for crossing the Antarctic Circle. There's also some other fun ones, though. If you were in the Goldfish Club for pilots, that is when they ditched their planes into the ocean and had to take to a life raft. You've got the Caterpillar Club, very cleverly named, for anyone who had to bail out using a parachute. So, of course, the silky material of the parachute is kind of like a silkworm, right? You've got a member of the commissioning crew of a ship, of course, was called a plank owner, and they later actually would sometimes get an actual plank of the ship when it was decommissioned. We've got some of those actually that come to visit our Intrepid Museum sometimes. And then, of course, to qualify for the Royal Order of the Whale Bangers, you had to have been on board a ship when it mistakenly fired at a whale, thinking that it was a submarine. So a lot of really fun things that they would come up with to keep them entertained. Now, another thing that was very common that kept them entertained was music. So Navy music has a very rich history, dates way back 200 years, even before, again, its founding in America. And music was commonly used to establish ship movements, battle rhythms, and to denote even special times of day, like when it was mealtime. And then, of course, crews sang songs or sea shanties, of course, which have been all the rage this year, to set a rhythm for hoisting the sails of a ship in unison. So just like the fife and the drums that were so popular in battle during the American Revolution, official fifers and drummers, were actually put to sea in the late 1700s as well. So eventually ship bands even became more and more popular as the years went on. And then by 1825, the USS Constitution even had its very own 20-piece band on board. Now, sailors would often bring their own instruments for entertainment, or sometimes they would even buy instruments at ports of call and, bring them back home and play them on the ship. Sometimes they would also even just make their own. Trench art was a huge thing. And of course, trench, being kind of referring to more of like the land-based things, but even just anyone on the ship they might string together a few different things and come up with their own little instrument. So in the picture on the top here, you can actually see a fun ragtag sailor string band from the USS Wheeling in the South Pacific during the early 1900s. Now, of course, the song Anchors Aweigh. So we talked about that phrase before. But that song really took off. It became the official fight song of the United States Naval Academy in 1907. And eventually, later on, you can see it was written by Charles Zimmerman. Eventually, in 1926, though, George Lotman made some changes to the lyrics to make it a little bit less specific to the Naval Academy itself and more just to represent the U.S. Navy as a whole. But of course, it has been around since then. It's also been adopted by several other navies around the world with their own lyrics, things like the Navy in Finland. And also during World War II, members of the Navy Women's Reserve, or the Waves, as they became known, also wrote Waves of the Navy to harmonize with Anchors Aweigh. So they had their own little spin on it too. Now, the sheet music, of course, for that, and also just other sheet music to be sung by the sailors, and also just to support them back home, also really took off during World War II. There were songs, again, like Bell Bottom Trousers that I mentioned earlier. There was a song, Fighting Sons of the Navy Blue. Also a song, We Are the Navy Mothers of America. And the Navy Air song, Pilots Man Your Planes, were also very popular. Specific ships, though, also came up with their own unique songs, such as even we found the Intrepid actually had its own fight song as well, which was sung to the tune of the song Stout-Hearted Men, which was a song that was made famous in the 1940 MGM musical film New Moon. And at first glance, it's a little bit weird. If you were to YouTube that song, you'd be like, I don't understand how it goes, but it actually does sync up to it pretty well. So maybe in another program, I'll sing that for you sometime. Now, another way to pass the time, of course, was art, and specifically some tattooing. Now, this, of course, the idea of tattoos is not unique to the Navy. Tattooing was practiced in early Europe and Asia by indigenous cultures worldwide, really, throughout thousands of years. But naval tattoos specifically became popular during Captain James Cook's voyage of exploration in the Pacific during the second half of the 18th century, which really exposed Royal Navy sailors to Polynesian body art. In fact, the word tattoo is derived from the Polynesian word tatau, T-A-T-A-U, which means basically leaving a permanent marking on the human body. And that word imitates the sound of the rhythmic tapping of the traditional tattoo instruments on the skin, too, which is kind of a cool relation there. So the needles that they used often back then were, needles made from boar's tusks. But tattooing really spread quickly from British to American sailors. And it, again, was a means of staving off boredom during these long hours at sea. So by the late 18th century, around a third of British and about a fifth of American sailors had at least one tattoo. And during the Civil War, tattoos were, things that were more general motifs like military insignia, a lot of anchors, I would assume, as well as, names of their sweethearts, on their skin would also be very popular. And then in 1898, at the onset of the Spanish-American War, many sailors also even rushed to get the slogan, Remember the Maine, tattooed on their chests before heading out to avenge her sinking as well. Now, the picture on the right here is a tattoo kit from the early 1900s. This was actually used during someone's service between the years of about, they think, 1901 to 1906. So you can see here, and I'll make it a little bit bigger for you there. You can see here we've got wooden needles. Ouch, right? You got ink and some sample artwork there. And they referred to this as flash art. So they had these little packets of, here's some examples of some of the things that we could do. They would also use, of course, if they didn't have those wooden needles, the ship's sail sewing needles for this purpose. And let me tell you, those sail needles are nothing to sneeze at. Those things are really, really thick. I've used one myself once for something, and it's crazy. So during World War I, though, there was a really huge swelling of, conservatism, really, throughout the country. We had, of course, prohibition starting to take a hold. Alcohol rations were completely abolished for the fleet. Navy recruits were strongly encouraged to cover up any sort of risque tattoo art that they might already have. This usually looked like, they'd put clothes on, a female figure that they had on them. But the sailors would then actually start to gear a little bit more towards patriotic tattoos. So things that reflected their enthusiasm for America's participation within their conflict. And over the years, naval tattoos then sort of developed a few of the essential military and patriotic elements that we see today. So things like a curved scroll with a slogan on it, a name or a date, or the stars and stripes, of course, or even like a giant eagle backdrop. Again, the eagle symbol that we looked at with the seal before, too. But there's also a lot of symbolism that went into it. Things like, for example, the braided rope tattoo. Typically, it was around their left wrist, and that indicated that they were a deckhand. You also had things like a compass or a nautical star, and that signified good luck, so that they could maybe always find their way back to port. You also had things like a dragon, which signified their service in Asia, or a swallow, the bird, which meant that they had traveled 5,000 miles at sea. Oftentimes, you'll see multiple swallows, so that means that they had traveled in increments of 5,000. Also, another common one was a pig on one foot and a chicken on the other foot. And that was said to protect a sailor from drowning. The origins of that is because animals were often carried on deck in wooden pens. And so if there was a shipwreck, the crates would float and they would often be washed ashore because, they'd have these animals that'd be all boxed up in there with their cargo still intact. So the sailors came to view the animals, who again would be washed ashore just fine, as a good luck charm. So that's why they have pigs and chickens on their feet. And then, of course, as the Navy expanded during World War II, there was a much greater acceptance of tattoos and body art. This is now leaving kind of the conservatism of World War I. And so this, in addition to the fact of we just had an increasingly multicultural pool of recruits entering the Navy, especially now into the 21st century, really led to the loosening of regulations governing tattoos. And now the Navy is actually the least restrictive among all of the U.S. branches of service regarding tattoos. Now, of course, in addition to expressing themselves artistically on their bodies, they also did the same on board their ships, too, through artwork. And much of that is still actually preserved all over our ship today at the Intrepid. So some of the pictures that you see here are actual paintings that survived from the Vietnam War era on the Intrepid. On the top left here, you can see a painting of a window in, of course, a windowless stateroom. You've got a tree and a sunny day outside their bedroom, curtains there. On the top right, we've got Disney's Goofy sipping on a cup of coffee in Intrepid's engine room, of course, caffeine being the fuel that sailors need to get their engines going. On the bottom left there, you've got a duck mascot and a motto. It says, "Go with the bold ones," for a division on board. And then also in the front of the ship in the anchor chain room, there is this road runner next to one of the chain pulley covers. It's all covered up there, preserved. And that's a reminder that, hey, those chains drop really fast when they lower the anchors, just like the road runner there. So a reminder, of course, be careful. So if you are interested in sailor art, be sure to keep an eye out in the coming year. We've got some exciting surprises planned for you, so do stay tuned for more about that in the coming year. But hopefully, everyone, this gave you a little bit of insight into the lives and the culture of the brave men at sea throughout history in our Navy. It is definitely a very unique culture. But again, every ship was essentially its own mini city at sea. And really, the camaraderie of the sailors established it really helped them to feel like a family and to keep some of their homesickness at bay. And a lot of this culture stemmed from that. All right, me hearties. So that about wraps up our program for today. If you've got any other questions about our programs, you can feel free to reach out to us through our website, intrepidmuseum.org, or also through social media. We've got live streams just about every day now on YouTube and Twitch and Facebook. So be sure to follow and subscribe to this channel or visit our website for the latest streaming schedules. Also, if you enjoyed this program, I encourage you to fill out a quick survey that you can find linked to in the chat right now. Now, as a reminder, once again, the museum is back open to the public 7 days a week from 10 to 5 p.m. So if you are in the neighborhood or passing by, we would love to see you in person at the ship, where you can check out, a number actually of these really neat sailor artifacts from life on board, as well as some of that sailor art that I just talked about decorating our walls. Our next program is this Thursday at 3 p.m. Golden Record Messages from Earth, where we are going to talk a little bit about the Voyager spacecraft and the golden records attached to them that are carrying messages and music and images from Earth to maybe someday make contact with distant civilizations. So tune in for that Thursday at 3 p.m. Once again, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully we will see you next time for another virtual Intrepid adventure. Bye.